So we'll get started here. This is much more informal, and we encourage you all to move toward the front. Gordon Flake has chosen to just sit down. He's not going to stand at the podium, so it's more of a conversation. The cameras are in the room because they're filming some. Gordon is somewhat of a celebrity. They're filming some B-roll. Call it B-roll. So your face might be a celebrity for a B movie we're making. No, Dodge. Sorry, I didn't offend you. I called it a B movie. It's not a B movie. It's a premiere. Okay. Well, I'm Eric Heyer. I'm the coordinator for Asian Studies, and tomorrow. Before I forget, let me remind you that there's a Korea seminar tomorrow in this room from noon to 2 with a handful of Korean experts coming, and they're going to focus on kind of Korean historical legacies in Asia, Korea, China, Korea, Japan, Korea, U.S. So it's really not just for people interested only in Korea, but for people who are interested in Asia generally. Korea will be the central focus, but Korea has been plagued by, has been befriended by, has been helped by, fought over by every other major Asian country in Northeast Asia. And the United States generally jumped into the fray at one time or another. But today, I thought, since Gordon Flake is a good friend of BYU, that he was arriving early, so it would be nice to have him sit down and in a more informal way talk with students about careers related to Asian studies in Washington, D.C. So this introduction is really informal, because Gordon Flake is a very old friend. In fact, when I was a young professor at BYU, Gordon was a young student at BYU. And I can point out now that his gray hair has almost caught up to my gray hair. But Gordon is an example of what we like students to do and what we like to see happen to students. He, after finishing his undergraduate degree at BYU, stayed on and received an MA at BYU in Asian Studies. It's a program we no longer have at BYU. And he did exactly what we wanted to do, gained a broad knowledge of Asia, broadened his knowledge of Asia, and wrote a master's thesis on Laos, which was kind of out of area because his background is Korea. He served a mission in Korea, speaks Korean fluently, has picked up Laotian along the way. But then he left BYU and he went to Washington, D.C., and initially started working for the Korean Economic Institute for a number of years, and then he saw an opportunity to switch and move up in the pecking order or do something a little bit different, and moved over to the Atlantic Council. Now, the Atlantic Council sounds a very Eurocentric place, and initially maybe it was designed to do European-American relations, but while he was there, among those people who were sort of inside and around Washington, D.C., all knew that the Atlantic Council had some of the best Asian experts on its staff. Gordon Flake, who specialized in Korea, and then another person named Al Wilhelm, who was a China expert. Both of them BYU, having BYU connections, either having gone to school here or graduated from here. And following his stint at the Atlantic Council, where he was actually Director of Research and Academic Affairs, Senior Fellow and Associate Director of Programs and Conflict Resolution. That was a kind of a cover for the Korea program, right? Indeed. It was conflict in Korea, so we'll just call it conflict resolution because Atlantic Council didn't want to reveal that they had sort of become taken over by Asianists. He moved on and now is the Executive Director of the Mansfield Foundation, which is also an Asia think tank organization, non-government organization, which focuses on Asia generally, but probably, is it fair to say, has a stronger Japanese connection because Ambassador Mansfield, who was the senator from Montana and one of I think only 2 senators who opposed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution.
Indeed.
So he was a senator with an Asian expert as a former historian and teacher of Asian history in Montana before he joined the Senate. So Gordon has been now running the Mansfield Foundation for 13 years. I was going to say a decade, but a little over a decade. So he's been around the track a few times in Washington, D.C. Other things, he's also a member of the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's a board member of the U.S. Committee of the Council for Security and Cooperation in Asia Pacific, and the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. and he continues to have an association with the Korea Economic Institute as on the advisory council there. And so he's helped facilitate that group coming to BYU on many occasions, and we appreciate the way you've given back to BYU, Gordon, and appreciate your taking time today to talk to our students about your career and the careers they might find also.
Well, thank you, Eric. I'm delighted to be here. It's really good to be back in this room. This is where I spent almost every day of my graduate school career here at BYU, so it's a very familiar room. Other than the big round table missing, almost everything else is exactly the same, so that's kind of nice. I'll have to confess that I still, despite a 20-year career thus far, still kind of wonder what I'm going to be when I grow up. At the time, I didn't think that Professor High was a young professor. He seems to be unchanged for the last 20 years. I, on the other hand, a little bit different. I will try to keep my opening remarks relatively brief because I think it would be most useful just to be able to answer your questions about different sectors. But I have had 2 decades to kind of focus very much on the policy community in Washington, D.C. Needs to go up, or you can hear, you can't hear? You're okay? All right. My entrance into my career didn't go as smoothly as I would have thought. I got a master's degree from BYU, and I was offered a job at the Asia Foundation offices in Seoul. And so I packed up my wife and our young child, and we moved back to my hometown in Arizona to wait 2 weeks for a visa. And that 2 weeks turned to 3 to 4. And eventually I took a job substitute teaching, waiting for things to kind of work out in terms of the Asia Foundation's budgetary process. And after 4 months on the Navajo Indian Reservation where I was raised, which is in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, with a degree in Asian studies and international relations, right? I was told that the job was still mine, but it had ceased to exist. And so my plans to move to Korea to start this great career just seemed horrible at the time. And this was one of these classic Lord works in mysterious ways kind of things. In retrospect, that 6 months was one of the best 6 months of my life, right? Time with my parents and my family that I hadn't had before. But at the time, it just seemed like a horrible way to start a career. And so we just loaded up a U-Haul, moved out to Washington, D.C., where my wife's family was, because if you want to focus on policy in Korea, there's really 2 choices, Seoul or Washington. Those are where the bulk of it takes place. And really, I just kind of pounded the pavement. I spent 2 months looking for a job, talking to everybody who would talk to me. It started with a few people I knew, and with every meeting I asked them, who else should I talk to? And they gave me 3 or 4 others. And within 2 months, I had pretty much met everyone who did anything related to Korea or Asia writ large kind of in Washington. I just really worked the system quite hard. And in the end, I was offered a job at a consulting firm, which I took mercifully. I had 2 other job offers from the Korean embassy, which I decided not to take. And about a week into it, I remember one of the principals telling me, if we keep this up in 6 months, you can be a deal maker. And I remember just being quite befuddled by that because I wanted to be a Korea specialist. I wanted to be like Eric Heyer, right? And in the end, the very next week, I was offered a job at the Korea Economic Institute as Director of Research and Academic Affairs. So I begged out of the first job and I moved to the next. And so in retrospect, had I taken a different career path, had I gone to Seoul, I wouldn't have had any of the opportunities that eventually just kind of laid themselves in front of me in Washington, D.C. I should also tell you a wonderful anecdote about my experience here at BYU. I came back after having served a mission in Korea, and there was probably 100 returned missionaries from Korea at the time. And Professor Mark Peterson, who some of you may know, and a couple of other professors at the time, called us all together in a room, one evening. And their purpose in this meeting was to dissuade us from trying to be Korea specialists, right? Because they said, look, there's not enough of a market out there. The market won't bear all of you being Korea specialists. And so if you really want to work on Korea, and we know you love Korea, and we know you love, your gung-ho post-mission, you need to get a business degree, you need to get a law degree, you need to be an engineering degree, you get a skill. You got to have a skill, and then you can parlay that to a job. And they told us this great story of the Underwood brothers, one who had become a Korea specialist and spent his entire career teaching in, I think, North Carolina, teaching about Korea in U.S. universities, and the one who became an American literature professor who spent his whole year in Korea, his whole career in Korea teaching American literature in Korean universities. And I remember just vividly sitting there in that room and thinking, because their basic line was this: if you're lucky, 1% of you, and there's probably 100 there, who said, will get to be a Korea specialist. And I remember thinking, you're just trying to scare us off, right? You're just trying to convince us, not to be Korea professors, right? Korea specialists as it is. But I look back now, 20 years later, and I think this was probably 6 months before Kirk Larson came in. I look back as, they're absolutely right. The only thing is I'm the 1%, right? I was the 1% among that group that was able to kind of work in the Korea field, and probably 6 months later, a year later, when Professor Larson came back, he was the 1% for that core group that came through in that process. But I had several opportunities during the course of my career to decide which direction I wanted to go. One time early on in my career, as I was working at the Korea Economic Institute as a director of research and academic affairs, which is essentially a think tank, right? Is running conferences, seminars, workshops, various studies on North Korea, et cetera. It's just kind of working in that broader policy milieu in North Korea. I was offered a job at a law firm to kind of work reporting back on Korea on the U.S. back to Korea. So working for Korean firms, but I wouldn't be focusing on Korea, right? And they offered me a salary which was 3 times what I was getting. I had a young family. It was a real kind of career moment for me where I had to decide, do I want to do this or not, right? And in the end, I decided to stay with the career trajectory I was going on. And again, I think in the long run, it's probably a very good deal because there are hundreds of people in Washington who can report on, the most recent economic statistics coming out of the Commerce Department or developments on the Hill, and can report back to Korean audiences. But there's very few that can try to explain, the nuances of leadership transitions in North Korea. So that, it was a clear decision on my part that I wanted to be a Korea specialist. So I did about 7 years at the Korea Economic Institute, and then began to be concerned that I was getting narrowly pigeonholed. I had also become very fascinated with North Korea, had taken several trips to North Korea, and so as a way of moving, and here I'll give another caveat, is in the field of labor that I pursued in the nonprofit sector, there is no career path. If you're in the military, there are clear hierarchies, and there's also clear promotion opportunities. The same is true as in government, the same is true in the private sector, and the same is true in academic setting, or in terms of how you move. In the nonprofit sector, most of the organizations are relatively small, and very few of the organizations can you move up in that organization. You've just basically got to jump to new jobs. And there's no I'm not following anyone's particular path, because you essentially are distinguishing yourself, hopefully through your writing, through what you say, but also in your networks and the people you know, that you will create the next opportunity. So after 6-7 years at the Korea Economic Institute, I wrote a grant that was funding from the Department of Energy that would fund an exchange with North Korea, basically bringing over North Korean delegations to the United States in the mid-1990s, 97, 98, 99. And that facilitated the move over to the Atlantic Council. And again, as Dr. Heyer mentioned, it was really a Euro-focused institution, but we had a grant and we had money. And if you come to an organization in Washington saying, I've got money that'll pay for my salary and give you overhead, you'll be surprised at the number of institutions which will give you office space as long as you pay for it, right? And you pay them overhead as well. So we ran that program for several years. And then the North Koreans test fired a missile over Japan, and everyone who had knowledge of our program disavowed it. The funding dried up. And mercifully, I was recruited to head the Marina Mike Mansfield Foundation. And so I've been doing that for 13 years. And I'll quickly tell anyone that asks that it's been a strange career path. I've never served in government, and so I really can't speak to you with great authority about a government career. I've never worked in business. I've never worked in a private sector context. I've never been in the military, never been in academia. But the one thing about the sector I have labored in is the think tank community, is you interact with all of the above and more on a regular basis, but you don't quite fit. And that's why I kind of half-jokingly said I've never had a real job in my life in terms of a logical one that makes sense in that context. I will be very candid. There are both pluses and minuses, right? On the plus side, the nonprofit, sector, the think tank community in Washington, D.C., is wonderfully meritocratic, right? Who you can talk to, who you can influence. There's really no hierarchy, right? There is some, of course, but there's very limited hierarchy. In the military, you can't even fraternize above a certain level of pay grades, in terms of rank levels, in terms of the military. Certainly, if you're in the government, anything you write is going to get scrubbed 14 times before it even gets up to the assistant secretary level, let alone up into kind of the principal's level in terms of decisioning. But in the think tank community, no one knows where you fit, right? And so you're able to interact with academia, even though you have no real academic credentials. You're able to react with military and forge close relationships with senior military people, because you don't kind of fit. It's just basically the strength of your argument, your ability to articulate your argument, and your hubris, your willingness to just kind of think that you ought to go out there and give them. And as a child, my father quickly said that I have a younger sister who he said had all the intelligence in the family, and that I had all the confidence. And I think he's kind of spot right on there, because it never once in my career occurred to me that it would be inappropriate for me to be telling the senior director of the National Security Council for Asia that I thought this is what I thought they should do, right? Because that's just kind of the environment that I was kind of raised up here in BYU, and that's kind of the general environment in Washington, where the people in the think tank community, your job is to think what other people should do, right, to come up with ideas. The other thing that's quite liberating about it is you do truly get a chance to kind of do very multidisciplinary stuff, right? You're able to kind of involve people's, individuals, institutions based on, what they've got to contribute to that particular project and to try to structure the project. And as I think back now over 20 some odd years, while on the one hand I maintain an effort to kind of be a Korea pundit or a Korea expert, and I, every day would get up and read voraciously all of the, the news media on Korea, and I'll talk with all the principals working on Korea, so I can maintain very up-to-date information about what's going on in Korea. That's my own personal area of expertise. But really, if you ask me where I'm an expert, it's increasingly on, how do you structure programs? How do you get the right people in the room? How do you identify the right people in the room? How do you structure the right meetings so you have a meaningful dialogue? How do you move that dialogue forward? How do you influence policy? That's really where my expertise is growing, because that's the bulk of what we're doing. If it's a meeting for meeting's sake, then it's a waste of my time. And I'll have to confess that after 20 years, I despise conferences. These large conferences where you have a formal presentation, where somebody reads a paper, and then they have two discussances, because it's just this horribly ineffective means of communicating information. And if you've got an audience that's there just to listen, that's one thing. But most of the meetings we do are intended to be a dialogue where there's real debate and exchange. And if people don't leave that room having learned something or having changed their minds, or forged different relationships or different prisms for looking at something, you've kind of wasted your time. So that's kind of the bulk of what I've done in that regard. To be really candid, the entry level for working in the think tank community in DC, and it's actually increasingly a global think tank community. So there are more and more organizations, be they in New York or Boston or Los Angeles or Seoul, which is extremely vibrant, some in Tokyo or Beijing, which are part of this international community. There's some in Europe as well, right? That are, it's growing. The entry level really is a master's degree if you want to be a participant in the dialogue. If you come in with a bachelor's degree, it's basically presumed that you will be kind of a logistics person. You will help organize the programs and get the hotels, and that you will do a research assistant type of role and kind of feed things into that. But your entry-level requirements are a master's degree to be a participant in the dialogue. And that just gives you the box checked, right? And once your box is checked, then you have to figure out, then you really have to distinguish yourself. You have to seek out opportunities to write. You have to write op-eds. You have to seek to get stuff printed, and then be part of the dialogue. If you don't have anything to say, then you're not part of the dialogue, right? So you've got to kind of develop that. That becomes the process. Then once you do that, then you become part of the international conferencing circuit. Once you've built up that reputation, you get respected, and they pull you into meetings. But it takes a while. It's a period of time investing in that process. Again, on the plus side, you interact with remarkable people. You kind of have firsthand, real-time information in terms of decision makers, policies. One of the great things about Washington, D.C. is that the world comes to Washington. So whereas if you're talking about domestic economic policies and you talk about inside the Beltway, it's a pejorative term, right? It means that you're clueless about how the real world works. If you're talking about foreign policy, inside the Beltway is where everything happens, right? It's where the decision makers are, and all the high-level political leaders come from Asia, where if I were to try to forge a relationship, with South Korean foreign minister in Seoul, and I was just Joe Schmo working on the street there, I'd never get through the screens to get to him. But when he comes to Washington, then it's much easier. They become a small fish in a big pond, right? Where they're competing for attention with the 180 different countries and a Congress and an executive branch that's largely indifferent because the whole world's coming towards them. And so as an analyst, as a think tanker, you have a lot of access to them in that regard. The negative side, if I can kind of talk about it, again, very candidly, is that you don't actually do anything, right? If you ask my kids what I do, they will say I talk a lot and have a lot of meetings. And that's pretty spot on, right? I'm not making decisions. I influence them, right? And in terms of policies, you're not directly involved in policy. You're not, you can tendentially be involved in education and giving seminars and stuff, but you don't have, I'm not building up generations of disciples that, like Dr. Heyer is, right, in terms of that regard, right? You're not, there's a difference. You're really working on the margins. You're peddling influence in that regard. So you're a little bit dislocated, right? In some ways, it's a bit of a game, right? I like to think we have influence, and increasingly, I tend to move towards programming that I think makes a difference, as opposed to just going through it for the motions. But as a good chunk of it, you are going through the motions, right? And if you just look at politics these days, an awful lot of politics in Washington is just talking for talking's sake, right? I mean, too much of it. Mercifully, in my narrow sphere of kind of Asian foreign policy, economic, trade, security policy, it's a pretty congenial bunch of people. We know each other pretty well. For the most part, I can give almost anybody in town's presentations, right? I know what they're going to say and what their kind of core views are. And it evolves, and then you begin to learn who you respect and who's going to be value added in terms of meetings in that regard. But it gives you a sense for what goes on. Let me try to wrap up my remarks there, which give you a sense of kind of what I've done. Let me just give you a little bit more information about Mansfield and the types of programming we do, just to give you a little bit more of an idea what is it that we do on a daily basis. And then I'll open it up and we can have a very broad discussion about government service, because although I haven't worked in government, I've spent 20 years in DC, and I have a real clear idea. There are different tracks, be it foreign service or commerce or treasury or the intelligence agencies. I'm happy to talk about the various positions on the Hill, which again, although I've been in DC in 20 years, it's to me this very foreign and ununderstandable kind of weird place in Washington, D.C., but I'll give you my candid assessments of that. And I'd be happy to talk to you about different career options or questions that you might have about it writ large. The Mansfield Foundation was established almost 30 years ago to honor Mike Mansfield, former senator from Montana, our longest serving ever Senate Majority Leader, our longest serving ever ambassador to Japan. And it was actually set up by the Congress in his honor with a seed grant which came to the Department of Education out at the University of Montana, where I mercifully have an office. So I have offices in DC, Tokyo, and Missoula. And you can ask where I like to go. I mean, Missoula, Montana is a spectacularly beautiful place, somewhat akin to Provo. You have the M on the mountain instead of the Y, as it works out. But a beautiful place to kind of work. The foundation has a very broad mission of improving understanding and cooperation in the United States and Asia, and we focus very much on public policy. We do not have a partisan tint. We tend to lean Democratic just because Mansfield was a Democrat, and many of my board, I struggle to keep Republicans on my board. I've got Howard Baker, former ambassador under Bush and former chief of staff under Reagan, but not many other Republicans, a few others. But in general, we're not partisan, and we don't tend to work in partisan works, whereas other think tanks around town, the Heritage Foundation, clearly Republican. American Enterprise Institute, clearly Republican. Center for Strategic International Studies kind of straddles. It is bipartisan, probably leans a little bit more conservative, but more middle of the road. Brookings, definitely more on the progressive side of the spectrum. Progressive Policy Institute, Center for New American Security, Center for National Policy. There's all the think tanks that they're doing much more partisan work, and they do a very broad spectrum of work. Whereas we are very much focused on Asia, narrowly defined as really it's Northeast Asia, and we pushed it into into Vietnam with some effort, really, but it's China, Korea, Japan. When I went there, I actually went there deliberately because I wanted to broaden my expertise. I didn't want to be pegged as just a Korea guy. And as any of you who are Korea specialists know, I learned my view of Northeast Asian history first and foremost in Korea. And so I kind of had this chip on my shoulder about Japan, and I have a hesitancy admitting that I've been now to Japan 54 times, which is more than I've actually been to Korea, because I have an office there. And I still have a hard time calling myself a Japan specialist, even though, again, I know everybody to know inside the entire Japanese political apparatus, just because I don't speak the Japanese language as well as I'd like to. I certainly can't operate in it like I can in Korean. And so it's hard for me to consider myself a Japan specialist in that regard. But I wanted to broaden, and I wanted to have the opportunity to do Vietnam and China and broader kind of regional other issues, just so I wouldn't be narrowly pegged, so I would have more career opportunities. But I did that after I had built a reputation of my own that would kind of carry me forth on kind of Korea issues. So the Mansfield Foundation does, again, primarily U.S.-Japan stuff, probably 60 to 70% of our programming are Japan. And I'll just give you maybe 6 or 7 programs just to give you an idea of what type of things we do. Our largest program is a fellowship program. Every year we select 6 or 7 U.S. civil servants, government employees, bureaucrats. We train them in Japanese for a year, and then we send them to work inside the Japanese government in their counterpart agencies. We've just selected our 100th fellow. We've been doing this for 16 years. And so now we have built this cadre of U.S. civil servants who speak Japanese, who know how the Japanese government works, who have friends and ties in that country, that are designed to kind of bring our two countries together, cooperating on every issue. So they're not just a few foreign service officers and military people. They're people from the Department of Health and Human Services, from EPA, from Justice, from Commerce, from Treasury, across the board. And what we've done is we've really built and improved the expertise on Japan within the United States government. We have just finished up a Committee on U.S.-Japan Relations, which is a follow-on to a Committee on U.S.-Korea Relations, and we have another Mansfield Committee on U.S.-Korea Relations kicking off right now. These are much more exercises on picking the horses, and I'll give you a perfect example. In 2006, relationships between President Bush and President Nomuhyun were like oil and water. We had real political crisis in UN-Korea relations. And so we decided that we wanted to try to invest in people in a post-Bush administration and in a post-Nomuhyun administration. And so this became an exercise in picking the horses. And I got a big grant to do this from another large foundation, from Smith Richardson Foundation. I deliberately did not have a co-sponsor organization and a counterpart organization because that would limit me based on their ideology and their networks and their friends. And so I essentially decided to pick people that I thought had the juice, people that I thought were likely to politically be appointed to serve in a post-Nomuhyun administration and a post-Bush administration. So I talked to everybody and their dog that I trusted. I just tried to weigh how much drive they had, what their networks were like, what their experience were like, who they were associated with, the likelihood of them being involved in the government. And our first Korea program was, we batted 1,000. I mean, not to brag a little bit, but we had to pick four progressives and 4 conservatives because you don't know which way the political winds will blow. This was 2 years before the Lee Myung-bak administration was inaugurated, and then more than 2 years before the 2008 elections in Washington, 2.5 years, right? And so we picked out 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. In the end, Kim Byung-guk, the first national security advisor for President Lee Myung-bak, was part of our group 2 years before MB. Kim Tae-hyo, his deputy national security advisor and chief foreign policy advisor, was part of our group. Kim Woo-sang, professor at Yonsei University, was first envoy to Washington for the President Lee Myung-bak during the transition, and then ambassador to Australia, was part of our group. Wee Sung-nak, senior advisor to the foreign minister, ambassador to the Six Party Talks, and now ambassador to Australia. So in other words, batted 1,000, right? Every single person that was part of our group were key advisors directly to President Lee Myung-bak, and we did this 2 years before Lee Myung-bak even was elected, right? It was just a great exercise. On the U.S. side, 5 members of Obama's Asia team were part of our group. So it's that same core group. We just picked the horses right. Japan turned out to be a much more difficult process just because access to influence power in Japan is much more limited. You really have a hard time getting Diet members. In the end, we got Hayashi Yoshimasa, who's a former Minister of Defense, but a young guy who wants to be Prime Minister. If the LDP ever comes back in, has a real shot at it. We had Kiyoshi Sugawa, Chief Foreign Policy Advisor for the DPJ. But again, Japan's a very different system. So we certainly didn't bat 1,000, but and what we accomplished on the U.S.-Japan one was different. Right now, we've just launched, we had our first meeting in Hawaii in January of our round 2 of the Korea. We're trying to replicate that for these upcoming elections. We're looking either Obama 2 or a post-Obama U.S. group, Democrats, Republicans, and a post-Lee Myung-bak on that side. So again, that gives you an idea. Not we're trying to directly influence policy, but there's nothing public about it. Nothing is released in public. For the first one, on the U.S.-Korea one, we put together a list of 1-page recommendations for post-Lee Myung-bak Korea policy, and post-Nomuhyun Korea policy towards the U.S. We never published it, never put it on our website. We handed it directly to the candidate-elect. And the key thing was his key people, it was their document. And by our count, 6 months after he was elected, 13 of the 14 items we put on there were implemented. They did them. Now, part of it's because they were their ideas too. They were part of the process, right? But it gives you an idea that we're directly able to say, these are the things you should do. This great joint vision statement that Obama and Lee Myung-bak put out in June 16, 2009, kind of direct outflow of how we structured it, drafted it. With the Japan one, we put together recommended edits to the common strategic objectives for the U.S.-Japan alliance. 2 months after our first meeting of the U.S.-Japan one, when the U.S. side and the Japanese side met to negotiate, they both came in carrying our recommended edits. We put together building blocks for a joint vision statement, U.S.-Japan. We put together a prioritized agenda for the relationship. So those are all kind of much more directly influencing the policymakers. We do also a lot of investment in scholars. We have what's called the Network for the Future program. We just selected a second cohort. There are hundreds of great scholars of Japan in the U.S. Most of them know an awful lot about academic issues in Japan, but have no bearing on policy, right? And yet you got a lot of policymakers who know nothing about Japan. So the idea was to try to make academics policy relevant. So we got the great kind of lions of the Japan Studies Community and Policy, Ezra Vogel at Harvard University, Susan Farr at Harvard University, Len Schopp at University of Virginia, and Michael Green, who's at Georgetown, but also kind of former senior director at the National Security Council in the White House, to be a selection committee. Out of 100 applicants, we picked the top 15 young, pre-tenured or recently tenured academics, and we brought them to Washington 3 times to meet with all the policymakers, Pentagon, White House, the Hill, everything. We trained them how to write op-eds. We had a professional op-ed writer come in to teach them how to write op-eds. We did media training interviews with them. We brought in NHK cameramen to coach them how to do media things. We took them to Montana to write policy briefs. We took them to Japan to go out and meet with all the political leaders in Japan. And the idea is we wanted to invest in people who had a real working knowledge of Japan so that they could then, in an educated, informed way, influence policy, to have real knowledge of Japan. We now picked a second cohort of that. We're doing the same project on the Korean side, which we're trying to get kicked off. We don't have the money in hand for that right now. An outgrowth of our Committee on U.S.-Japan Relations was a series of prioritized agenda. So right now, on March 16th, we're kicking off a U.S.-Japan nuclear working group. Japan right now has 54 nuclear reactors, only 3 of which are running right now. By the end of April, they could have 0 running. And so there's a major kind of crisis moment in Japan in terms of nuclear energy that impacts the U.S. I mean, I don't know how much you guys know about this, but the Japanese basically own the U.S. nuclear industry, right? We don't have our own independent nuclear. I mean, Toshiba, owns Westinghouse, and Hitachi owns GE. For the large part, it's the Japanese that own it. And where they go, we're going too, although we don't quite realize it yet. And so we have a real vested interest in getting all the right people in Japan. So we have the chairman and vice chairman of their Atomic Energy Commission, 2 former heads of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, key academics, key private sector people, key government people from the White House and the Kante coming together in San Francisco for a first meeting of our U.S.-Japan Nuclear Working Group. Then we have a second meeting in May. We have another kind of U.S. and Japan Transportation Working Group, which is funded by Toyota. Dr. Toyota Shoichiro, as in the Toyota's on my board of directors. And since he's on the board, sometimes you do what your board tells you to do in that regard. But you get a whole range of programs. A program on South China Seas we did last May in Hong Kong, looking at the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea in South China Seas and bringing together the key involved states to kind of get them together on the same page as we're moving forward. We have a big project on crafting a new economic vision for U.S.-Japan relations that's underwritten by the Japanese corporate community to try to figure out longer term what our relationship should be like. So we've picked young academics, young government officials, and young private sector people to come together to kind of craft this next generation vision. So that gives you an idea. There's just lots of programs like that. Exchanges, seminars, workshops, task force. We had 2 big projects funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency that looked at Northeast Asia 2025. So it's kind of a very interesting thought exercise where you get outside the box, things are together. We go to Montana, we spend a full day saying, what is the ideal security state in Northeast Asia in the year 2025? What does it look like? How do you define it? And just putting a very bullet point list of descriptions of what the ideal looks like. And then based on that ideal, coming up with a long list of divergent trends or obstacles to the ideal. And then based on that long list, going through and prioritizing it by receptivity to policy measures, imminence, relative importance, et cetera, and then addressing those issues and putting out a published volume that's very much prescriptive. So again, I hope that gives you an idea of kind of the things we do. So a lot of my day is spent, I travel a lot, I do a lot of speaking, I'm involved in a lot of conferences, I go to other people's conferences on a regular basis, and then a lot of logistics, a lot of fundraising, a lot of money. My wife calls me a professional beggar. Next week I'm up in New York just to shake the money tree. I spend a lot of time writing grants, building relationships with grant writers, and because no matter how great the idea is, if somebody doesn't fund it, it ain't going, right? So again, that gives you hopefully an idea of kind of what I do in the field. And unless, Eric, you think I've left something out you think I want to address particularly, I think I'll stop there and open it up for questions more broadly.